Welcome to Chaplin's Compass, navigating spiritual care amid these challenging global times. My name is John Betts.
And I'm Alicia Tremaine. And John, today we're talking about politics. I think in this show we have talked about religion, we've talked about death. Now we're going to break all the taboos, talk about politics. Actually, not really. We'll talk about what happens when patients want to talk about politics. And we have a great guest on the show, Nicholas Colora. Thank you for being here, Nicholas, and welcome.
Well, thanks. So good to be here with you.
So Nicholas is the director of the Radius program at MIT. He's also a board-certified chaplain and a spiritual director. And he gave a great workshop at the APC conference recently on the topic of when patients talk politics. And I'm really interested to hearing more about that. But first, Nicholas, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you into chaplaincy, maybe how your role has changed over the years and what you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, as a young kid, I was just in love with the arts and in particular, film and literature. And I thought for a while about becoming a filmmaker, but I wasn't quite brazen enough to promote myself when I did my internship in Hollywood one summer during college. And then I thought about becoming a film studies professor, but felt like my research was just kind of being oriented towards an elite audience of postmodern specialists. And so I took some time off after my master's degree program in film and literature and did a year with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which is kind of a postgraduate volunteer program, and realized how much I enjoyed being with real people in their real stories. And so I spent a few years as a Jesuit after that. And when I discerned that that wasn't the path for me, I wound up doing CPE. I'd done a unit in divinity school. Swore at the time I'd never do another one. But the time was right after I left the Jesuits. And mostly I kind of felt like I just wanted the opportunity to process this question of who I was at the time with some peer supervision, with some one-on-one supervision. I figured, well, if I get some pastoral care, spiritual care skills, that'll be great. But wound up falling back in love with healthcare chaplaincy in a way that I hadn't before. And so, a few years as a palliative care chaplain, sort of a population health chaplain for a healthcare organization that I'm sure I'll talk more about later. That was my first clinical context, and wound up working for a few years, directing the psychosocial spiritual side of a hospice organization. And now I'm working at MIT as a university chaplain and directing this ethics program, which is called Radius.
So I know this is not what we're talking about today, but I'm just really curious right now. Has your film knowledge and interest, has that ever intersected with your work as a chaplain? And do you have any plans to do some more with that? Because that's so interesting.
Oh, gosh, I would love to. Well, I think creativity kind of shines through everything that I do. I have kind of an aesthetic sensibility. Yeah, from time to time, I've done like a little promotional video for various things that I've been involved in. For example, when I was directing that hospice team, we had our kind of year in review where we honored our patients who had died in our service. And normally, we'd kind of film some of the chaplains or social workers talking about their experiences with patients, and we just kind of put that together. And I got to be a little creative with that one when I did that for the first time in terms of the use of music and other kinds of imagery.
That's great. But it is interesting to figure out how much the arts has influenced chaplaincy, and the people that I run into left and right, where they've been influenced by the creative performing arts, the visual arts. I mean, I majored in music in my undergrad and wanted to be an opera singer, so I can join that subgroup. And then, of course, I also discerned, nope, want to do that.
I didn't know that about you, John. We'll have to talk about that sometime.
I wanted to be the fourth tenor. Yeah,
Aww.
But no.
So, Nicholas, I heard such great things about your presentation at the APC conference on When Patients Talk Politics. I heard a couple of people say it was the best session of the conference. And right now, there's so much going on in our country recently that makes this topic so relevant for us, I think. I'm wondering how you came up with that topic. What made you decide to present on this specifically?
I was working for this house calls program that I mentioned before, mostly seeing patients on our palliative care service. It's kind of a healthcare nonprofit called Tandem Health, which helped primary care practices to manage their patient populations. So usually I was with palliative patients. And then sometimes actually there were patients whose physical health was okay, but there was an assessed spiritual care need. So I was able to visit them too. So I'd visit patients in their homes. And at the time I covered an area that stretched from the city of Philadelphia itself out to the leafy suburbs of, let's say, Bucks County, all the way almost as far out west as Amish country. So an incredibly diverse area. When we talk about Pennsylvania being a swing state, here we are recording this in July of 2024. I would swing from one end of that spectrum to the other on a daily basis in my work. And this was from 2018 to 2021 or so, during the years of the Trump administration and COVID and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter. I noticed that patients were talking about politics more than they ever had when I was in a different kind of context, let's say in the hospital or something, at a different time. And patients would often implicitly assume that I agreed with them, for one thing, which put me in an awkward position sometimes, especially, some white identifying patients who assumed, okay, here's a white guy, he must share all of my own beliefs. If I was talking to, let's say, an older white patient, and it put me in a tough position. I feel like we're taught, either that's a taboo, let's avoid this entirely. This is just going to distract us. This is the patient's time to talk about their spiritual well-being. Let's not talk about politics. I could see the rationale behind that. But at the same time, again, 2020, 2021, we're talking more and more about allyship. We're having an understanding that racism is a social determinant of health. And so this question would kind of arise, can I really care for the health and well-being of, let's say, my patients of color if I'm silent in the face of the racism of their neighbors? Or I would find, okay, even let's say it's a white patient who's saying all these things that I would interpret as racist. And then in the next breath, they say, oh, and by the way, here's my home health aide who doesn't seem to like me very much. I can't figure out why. And maybe they were a person of color. And so seeing too how a person's politics or their way of expressing politics impacted their own relationships, health and well-being as well. So I sort of felt caught between, on the one hand, saying, okay, this is not my job. It's not my territory. Try to divert, talk about something quote unquote germane to spiritual care. And on the other hand, the part of me that felt like a, Dietrich von Bonhoeffer or something, who said, no, it's important to be prophetic. It's important to speak clearly in the face of these great social and interpersonal ills. And so I kind of had to ask myself the question of what to do. And in a way, I think a lot of our conversation will be the unfolding of my way of reckoning with that question. And I was fortunate at the time that I had some really good teammates on our integrated health team. Also have a really terrific colleague who I want to name, Medina Jones, who's working as a chaplain in Philadelphia. And she and I were talking about this at one point and said, well, what if we really thought about this and maybe developed some kind of presentation? So actually, she and I together presented it the first time, whatever that year was during the pandemic, I guess it was 2020 or 2021, that we had an APC meeting and kind of articulated some of what we were thinking about here. Medina was just so instrumental to developing a lot of the ideas that we're going to talk about today. She wasn't drawn to the speaking circuit, so to speak, but just want to name her and all this. And
yeah, that's good. Give her credit.
100%. Yeah. And wound up, I published an article and tried my best to, especially to signal some of the really seminal ideas that she had in the footnotes. Published an article called When Patients Talk Politics. And I have found, before people even hear what I have to say about it, so I'm not taking any credit here, but it's just to say that I think it landed us on a really important topic, because pretty much anyone who hears this title says, oh, I would love to know, give me 2 copies of that article, or know if my ideas are helpful at all, but I know it's an important topic.
I think a lot of chaplains can probably relate to that conflict within themselves, but also with just the awkward position when patients assume that you agree with them for any number of reasons. I think especially if they believe that you're the same faith tradition as them, and then their own interpretation of what that faith tradition believes, people tend to assume that everybody in that faith tradition shares these same beliefs, and that somebody like a chaplain would be in support of all those same beliefs. And a lot of times it's not the case. So chaplains can really feel like they're in an awkward spot when that assumption is made.
Yeah, I mean, working in hospice, I found something similar where you would talk with a lot of people in their homes, and so it was very open to discussions about all kinds of things. I mean, there were a lot of assumptions being made about, oh, well, if you're a minister, then you should believe X, Y, and Z. Oh, tell me more about what you think. And I'm like, well, I want to hear more about what's going on with you. But that kind of steered me away from getting into some of those hot button issues. But still, I can hear you. That can get pretty dicey so how do we use our wisdom to be a prophetic voice?
And one of the things I've found in developing these materials and practicing this difficult art with patients, especially when politics comes up, is being aware first and foremost how easy it is for us to get triggered around some of these projections. Many of us have, a whole year of residency or however long it takes in our training to get used to when someone calls us reverend, even if we aren't ordained, or, makes an assumption about our image of God. We don't get as much practice usually when it comes to politics. And because most of us are living in these raw, difficult political times and maybe having difficult conversations with loved ones and so on, it's very easy for stuff to get triggered. And the more I looked at everything that political conversation could be laden with, because not to bury the lead, I think kind of where I came out of this tension of should I talk about it with people or not, which often meant should I be completely silent or should I try to convince someone to agree with me, that the middle way was actually to just take their politics seriously as material for spiritual assessment, trusting that a person's politics says a lot about what they value, what they fear, how they relate to others, their sense of where they and their ancestral lineage fit in to history, into the cosmos. So understanding how laden political discourse can be. And so then it made sense for me too, when I was feeling uncomfortable about patients' projections, I understood that some of that stuff was getting triggered in me too. So when we do this work, we try to begin, I think, with looking at our own triggers and understanding our own sense of what politics means to us.
Yeah, you're right. It's an expression of values, but also interesting how you say it's an expression of what people fear. So how did you go about developing this spiritual assessment in the context of politics?
Out of this wonderful conversation with, again, my colleague, Medina Jones, who really had the insight, and it's a brilliant idea, I think, and we've done it together and I've done it individually when I present on this material, is often to start really with a look at our own experience so that we can just understand experientially what it means to say that politics is tied up with all sorts of other things, including things that manifestly are spiritual. So Medina's idea was to do, at the beginning of a workshop, a kind of land acknowledgement. And probably most of our listeners are familiar with those, where we acknowledge that most of us live on the unceded lands of Indigenous peoples who were killed or evicted, forcibly removed from the land. And so often, we name, I am living on the unceded land of the Massachusetts people, for example, in my case here in Massachusetts. And Medina said, well, what if we really, rather than just do that as kind of a pro forma check the box kind of thing, really develop that into an extended guided meditation. And so what she and I do when we present this material is to invite people to really think through and feel through what it feels like to be told this land is not originally yours. You are living on the land of others to whom it has a deeper history. And we were helped in this by a resource by Michelle Nahani, who's an Indigenous knowledge keeper and a social worker, I think, who talks also about when we talk to people in the context of settler colonialism, all the different kinds of emotional responses that we can get. And they can look like Kubler-Ross's 5 famous dimensions of grief, right? Well, I didn't ask to be born here. Or why are you haranguing me about this? Isn't that in the past? We see all this denial and bargaining and so on, as well as sometimes grief. And so then we ask ourselves, we ask people that we're doing this exercise with, what do you feel in your body? What emotions are you feeling? And people will often spontaneously come up with images of their own ancestors or some of the family stories that they heard. Often we grow up hearing, our grandparents came here and roughed it out as farmers, and now look, we're so prosperous and so on. But that's really a very abbreviated history that leaves a lot of other people out. And so when these kinds of narratives are challenged, we feel a lot, usually in our hearts and our bodies. And so we just kind of get implicitly and experientially. And then I'll usually ask a group that I'm with, now, does this seem spiritual to you? Do these concerns seem spiritual to you? And usually the answer is yes, they do. And so that's kind of where it began. And Judith Butler has a really elegant phrase that I think encapsulates a lot of this for people, where she asks, what's the grief beneath the grievance? And we know this can be true in interpersonal conversations that have nothing to do with politics, that there's some anger and we know there's sadness underneath. All the more so, though, I think, when we look at politics and when people are really inveighing against a group of people or a policy or something, to really be curious about what are you grieving there? And, it's not always pretty. It can be a fear of being, quote unquote, replaced or something, and not just to give a pass to anything without looking at it critically. But it is understanding that there's an emotional experience there that could enter into a spiritual assessment.
You said you tested this out with patients. how did the first try of this way of doing spiritual assessment go? And when did you figure out, like, okay, this is actually, there's something in this?
I remember one patient, this is what made me believe that it was possible, that this was more than just theoretical. I was talking to a patient, Mennonite, older gentleman who was initially referred to me. He was grieving because his wife of many decades had died. And he was becoming ill as well. Loved this guy. And often, he was very, very sweet. But often when he would tell stories about his life as a farmer, and his parents were farmers and his grandparents were farmers, and he would kind of come up against this realization that not many young people are working in farming anymore. He'd get very sad, and sometimes he'd get upset, and he'd go into complaint mode. And he'd say, younger kids these days, or this generation. And it's one of those projections where it's like, he knows that I'm in my 30s. He can probably guess I'm not a farmer. He's talking about my generation, but he trusted me enough to say. And there were a lot of other ideas that I would consider to be outmoded too, that would come up sometimes when he reflected on society and gender and race. But the thing about this patient was that he and I shared a special bond. I really liked him and he really liked me. And conversations didn't always meander into politics. So I experienced what it was like to, when it did come up, to be able to talk about it in the context of a relationship that was respectful and reverent. And at some point, as we were kind of processing his grief over a lost way of life, as he'd experienced it, that was tied up with how he met his wife and how they lived together and so on. As you will when you process grief, at some point you're going to look at various different dimensions of it. And I felt the invitation at one point to ask him when he started going into, and now everything is terrible. At one point I said, is it really that stark? Is there nothing good about advances that have been made over the last few decades? And was there nothing unproblematic about life as you were growing up? And I don't know how that question came to me, but it just kind of came to mind and I trusted the intuition. And he paused and he said, I'm ashamed to say this, but when I was growing up, I was taught that Black people were less than white people. It was just very honest of him. And at the end of our conversation, every time I visited him, we'd end with prayer. And at the end of it, and I would ask him, what would you like to pray for? And he said, probably something like, let's pray for Black people, is probably how he put it. And how I took that was also to pray for an end to systemic racism. And he really appreciated it. And I said, my God, it's the first time in my career as a chaplain that I have been invited to prayed with someone for an end to systemic racism. And it kind of opened something up in him. He remembered other moments in his life when, although he's generally conservative, when the Iraq War happened, he as a Mennonite, a peacekeeper, had written to George Bush to say, I oppose this war. And it just opened up another dimension of who he was, both for him and I think for me as well, and made the life review just that much more beautiful. So that experience kind of encouraged me to think that talking about this kind of stuff was okay under the right circumstances. Doesn't always work. It's not always appropriate. So sometimes, as a way of kind of answering your question about some of the first few conversations that would happen, I learned that for me, something that would be really helpful, so as not to get stuck in that corner of projections of like having smiled and nodded and then having to somehow break it to a person that maybe I'm not going to continue smiling and nodding, is that whenever politics would come up, I kind of developed a script for myself, which was to say, now I hear you bringing up politics, and just to say from the beginning, I don't know what your politics are. You don't know what mine are. We might disagree. And I just want to know if it's okay for us to talk about that, even if we do disagree. I'm here to know what this means for you. Or another version of that might be, I hear you talking about politics and I'm totally for it. And maybe you can help me to understand what this has to do with your spiritual life, how this connects. So I would come prepared with kind of a script. And sometimes just mentioning like, okay, I hear you talking about politics was enough to completely, the person would say, yeah, you're right. Better not to talk about politics. I wasn't telling them not to, but they would say, okay, no, come to think of it, maybe this could get a little dicey. And that's their prerogative, and so the conversation go in a different direction.
And what I'm hearing you say also is what I hear with a lot of politics discussions is this continually reverting back to a nostalgia of times that might have taken place in that person's mind, looking back to a past that is fond for them, but not fond for other people. I liked how you mentioned you essentially tried to de-mythologize the nostalgia, not in a way of, well, that didn't actually take place, but more I hear that. It sounds like what was true back then.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think that, many of us from our chaplaincy training, we might hearken back to that idea, if this was part of our training, of functional subgrouping, where among a group of people who even seem to agree on a particular position, get them talking to one another, and they might eventually see that they have differences. And experiencing difference helps them to then go to the other bigger group that they originally disagreed with, and to understand a little bit better where they're coming from, because they've become used to looking at complexity and tolerating difference. And I think what I would find, John, was that sometimes in even just phrasing that as, we might disagree, and is that okay? It would put people into a place of like, it's okay for there to be some disagreement here, and I can begin to empathize with another point of view. So for example, I think about, again, just the sweetest possible woman who in the sweetest possible tones would say the most horrible things about the Black Lives Matter protesters at the time that this was happening. And so, okay, what's the spiritual assessment here to start there? She made it very clear what she was afraid of. She was afraid that protesters would come into her, and it was a leafy, suburban neighborhood, and tear her house down or something. She was afraid of this. So I could chart in a spiritual assessment fear of civil unrest. And the interventionist kind of say, okay, so tell me more about what your fears are. And she would kind of articulate, a view of what the protesters were about, which didn't really match my own. And I would say, I see that this is so scary. If that's what the people you're talking about really felt, that would be very scary. And then just saying, is it all right if I offer another way that I've heard it talked about? And of course, I'm talking about my own politics here, but I've also heard it talked about that, maybe there's this anger in an unjust system or so on, and they're not really trying to do X, Y, Z. And it was just introducing a little bit of difference, that if it were, let me argue with you here and attack your views, we probably wouldn't get anywhere. I remember at the end of that conversation, she was able to say, I was probably a little sheltered growing up, and that's kind of as far as it went. But I just noticed in what she would want to talk to me about in subsequent conversations, it never really came up again. Does that mean she just felt she didn't feel safe to talk to me about it? Does it mean that it was like she got it out of her system? I don't know, but I know that our relationship continued to be really good after that. And so I think it may have been an effective intervention.
And going with that when we're talking with certain groups of people, there might be times where we find ourselves, oh my gosh, agreeing with them, where there's this, we've been talking a lot about where we might disagree with them, but where we might agree with them. And what are some of the dangers, but also the opportunities for that kind of a conversation?
In a way, it kind of comes back to what we started off by talking about with this idea of projection. What's really happening when we encounter someone who is projecting something of their own religious identity or religious expectations onto us? I think a moment like that kind of reminds us of what our role is as chaplains, which is not actually to be the spiritual authority. It's not to walk in and assume their work, which is to relate to God or to the ultimate or whatever they understand. It's really to help them rediscover their own spiritual authority. Whatever I may feel or believe, I'm really here to serve your own appropriation of these things. And I think that's maybe one of the risks when politics comes up. Again, we can get triggered, and we can be triggered as well by the desire to finally, here's a patient who agrees with me, and let's talk about it and kind of be friends here or something. Even though we might actually end up disagreeing, and that could be difficult on some point, and that could be difficult. So the challenge or the risk, I think, is, are we able to have the presence of mind to really know what our role is, that it's not actually to even be too approving of a person's politics. It's to help them understand what this means to them. And so sometimes we do have to take on just as much neutrality with someone that we agree with, even as, of course, it might look different. The questions we ask are going to be different. And I think we can embrace that as a part of it. But, even if we agree on politics, that might not be the most important thing here, because if the person's viewpoint is really despairing about the state of the world or the state of the country, we also don't necessarily just want to get them down in the dumps saying, I know, isn't it terrible the way the world is? So again, it's, what does this mean to you? What's the grief? What's your story? Where are the resources? All these things that we'd ask any patient.
As you're discussing, one of the things that I think some people might have popping up in their minds, especially as we are heading into the holiday season, is, oh yeah, Thanksgiving and some of the holidays during the winter months, I'm going to be talking to my family members and politics might be coming up. Do you have any great advice to people who might be dreading some of those times and with their own family, which, as one of my CPE certified educators said, the umbilical cord is the one piece of material that stretches through space and time and is one of the most pliable things around.
Yes, it's so true. Well, thankfully, anything I'm saying about chaplaincy, thankfully we don't have to be and shouldn't be our family members' chaplains. So there's that. There's always that. But if there's a commonality here, one of the things I always try to make a point when talking about this, when patients talk politics stuff, is we have to be really grounded in order to have these conversations. And part of that, maybe the first or preliminary part, is feeling safe. So if I'm a chaplain of color, for example, I don't think I should have to see it as my job to help a person process these generations of family racism necessarily, unless I feel safe enough to do that. On a given day, whatever my identity is, I might come in feeling more or less triggerable. And so it begins with that self-care. And that's probably good advice for any of us when we're talking about politics, is really to be grounded. I'll say that this is probably not good practical advice, but it's more of a spiritual thing that I've been sitting with. When we think about what it takes for a person really to be able to say potentially hateful things about any other person or group of people, that can be liberals as well as conservatives too. What is really going on there in that person's soul? I think often behind that, there's a lot of soul loss. There's a loss of our sense of connectedness and union with others, our sense of belonging to a human family. So often, I think there's soul loss, to use that term, the different, it's been spoken about in different contexts. And I think the best thing that we can do, if we're going to wade into those waters where someone is living through and speaking out of kind of a loss of soul, is to really make sure that we're in touch with our own soul. And so whatever that looks like, whatever kind of grounding in our own value system that takes, seems really important. And there's going to be times when we're just not there yet. And so we're only going to be able to see an enemy, even in family members. And then there's other times when maybe we'll begin, because we're settled enough within our own spiritual ecosystem, to understand how much tremendous hurt or pain or fear or grief can be behind someone saying something really totally objectionable. And it doesn't excuse what they're saying, but puts it in a wider context. I think so much of this work is about seeing the context that, we've come to know that if one person is saying or doing something mean, for example, or maladaptive, there's probably some trauma, or there's a family system behind that the person was raised in. And so we're able to see the context. And it's the same when politics comes up. There's a context of, there's a societal journey that a particular group of people is on. And it's so big that, it's hard to live in that empathy all the time. But it's there, there's this context behind everything.
I do think you bring up a really good point about how some things may be more triggerable, maybe you said, or more personal to some chaplains, depending on their context and the layers of diversity that we all have. For instance, abortion may be a topic that may be really touchy and personal to some, or for instance, immigration. I'm an immigrant myself, so I know sometimes those topics can feel a little personal to me, and there are so many other examples like that. So I like what you said about knowing yourself first and where your values are, where your triggers are, and feeling grounded and safe before you would start a conversation like that I think is very important.
Yeah, I'm always, I'm aware of my own identity as a white, straight man who much of this material has been developed out of a desire to be a good ally and advocate or accomplice, while also being a good chaplain. And that's often been the tension. And rarely have I been made personally to feel unsafe. So I want to name that in what I've developed. The wonderful thing about this topic and this community, I think, of professional chaplains at a difficult time in history, is that whenever I present this material, it's just always so rich to hear people share back from their own diversity of experiences and how this lands and what feels helpful or right will differ from chaplain to chaplain. And I think everyone will have their own style and their own way of doing it. The scripts that I've developed, for example, are different from the scripts that others might develop. But it's really been so enriching to hear what this looks like from a diversity of chaplains' perspectives. And I always say, and I say it to anyone listening now, if you have experiences of success or failure or interest in talking to patients who are talking about politics, I know that I'm always curious to hear about them because it's just so interesting and we can all benefit from each other's experience.
So now that you've been doing some of those workshops, you've written the article, and you've had some conversations with other chaplains, what do you think are the key messages or takeaways for chaplains when this topic comes up? Like, what's important for us to recognize or do in that moment you would find the most important?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I would say is to take this stuff seriously. I remember a CPE supervisor of mine who said, often the first thing that a patient says when you walk in their room turns out to be the key to the whole conversation, because it's top of their mind. I mean, not that there aren't other layers beneath it that we can access together, but that's where they are. And so if a person starts with politics, that's where they are. Whatever you feel is the appropriate, it's not always to try to make that the center of your spiritual assessment. Sometimes it is appropriate just to say, there's other things here. Or to ask people to connect what they're saying now to their spiritual concerns. It's remarkable. I could tell stories about people just switching over to, I know what's underneath this stuff about politics, and here it is. It's that I'm really disagreeing with my daughter about these issues, and our relationship is worse since ever been. I've had patients just be able to pivot and tell me that. So it's not that we always have to talk politics, but I think the most important thing that I've learned is to take it seriously as an entry point into where they might be. And then each of us uses our own chaplain's instinct to figure out where to go from there.
Also, from what I've been hearing you say, is being able to know your trigger points is essential. When we start seeing ourselves get hooked into certain things, being aware of that, because we all have some sort of thing which pushes our buttons. So when we have those times, being able to step back and have the wherewithal to go, oh, I need to either step away, or I need to pivot, or I need to sit in that uncomfortable space a little bit more. So
this is hot off the presses, so to speak. Just in the last few weeks, I've been reading a bit of Richard Schwartz, who developed internal families systems. And some listeners might know this body of knowledge better than I do, but a point he's always making, the basic point of IFS is that we've all got these different parts within us, and we can really help a client, if we're a therapist, understand, okay, there's a multiplicity within me. There's different parts that might have different protective functions within me, and so on and so forth. But he says that's true of us as well. He speaks for himself as a therapist, and he says we need to be sure that it's not these kind of scared or possessive or controlling parts that are leading when we're talking to the patient. He has a lovely phrase. He talks about self-energy. Itself is kind of this capacity for curiosity and compassion and creativity that isn't overly affiliated with one of these wounded parts. So it's kind of that connection, whether it's God or essence or being. And he's always making that point, lead with that when you really do inner work with people. And I think when my idea is that when we talk about politics, it's actually not talking about something superficial. It's often talking about something so cosmic or so archetypal. It's really, really deep stuff. And so we need to be aware, I think, in the same way that we're leading with that self-energy, that curiosity.
That's so important. That's a great point, because I think, any care professional, health professional, we are very subject to experiencing compassion fatigue, and we can get to a point where we get resentful of the very people that we're caring for, and that can be really harmful if we lead with that kind of energy. So that's an important point. Nicholas, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and just you're such a fascinating person, and I'm so glad that you were able to impart some of this wisdom that you've acquired in the last few years. And I'm just wondering what's giving you life these days, like what's filling your cup?
Oh, thanks for that question. It's kind of rediscovering a connection to the natural world. That's been really helpful for me. And some creative writing. Yeah, going back, again, I described myself as that film studies major before I got into chaplaincy. And so exploring my own creativity in different ways these days, that's been really, really nourishing.
I hope you continue to do that. We need more creativity in chaplaincy too. And maybe we need some films. Don't you think we need some chaplaincy videos?
Some good films, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying anything about any chaplain films that have already happened. It's more of,
Well, thank you for the great conversation, the opportunity to talk about this stuff, and the listeners. And I mean it when I say I'd love to hear from anyone who has any ideas.
Yes, please. We do have a voicemail. And by the way, thank you so much to listeners who left us lovely voicemails talking about your reaction to the podcast. We appreciate it so much. And also people who have left ideas through the voicemail and other places. we really appreciate those stories and just connection with you and to hear about how these episodes are resonating with you in your practice. So yes, do let us know how this episode spoke to you or what other ideas you have and experiences that you've had through the voicemail or other means to contact us. We are now on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. Where can they find us, John? They can find us everywhere now.
Pretty much almost everywhere. We're not on X. We're not on the Twitterverse. Yeah, we're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. On Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review or your favorite place for podcasts. And now it's time for the non-anxious presence with John and
Elise. Well, I love this conversation. You know why? It made me encouraged to think that Nicholas has found a way to be authentic with people that he's serving in chaplaincy, but do it in a way that is really helpful, that is still providing pastoral spiritual care, that is still listening and assessing for spiritual distress, how we can guide that patient. Because I feel like a lot of times, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but it almost feels like you're being disingenuous when you're trying to step around these questions, whether they are about politics or our own spiritual beliefs or traditions. And you try to sidestep those conversations, and it almost feels like, oh, if you really knew what I believe, maybe you wouldn't let me be your chaplain, just there's part of that feels tricky. And so I love how he has this script that says, we may disagree, but you're welcome to talk about it. Let me help me understand you better. I just feel like that seems so sincere and a good way to start the conversation.
I agree. Politics come really like political values. And even to take it a step further, people get really excited about their partisan values a lot of times. And so they really illumines where our values are. And when we visit people, their politics, their beliefs, their convictions is akin to seeing their values and seeing them as whole people. I love what Nicholas was saying about being able to do effective spiritual assessment is being able to see their values in the midst of their politics and being able to provide them that care in the midst of that. So I love that. Sitting and reflecting, I think he said, reflecting and sitting in the idea of living in the land of others was, for me, beginning with that idea of having that, where do we go from there? I brought up the piece on going and talking with families, and I'm glad he brought it up. The idea of our family systems don't fall very far from a lot of our family systems. So being able to be aware of those triggering times when we're talking with our family might give us a better idea of those times of potential triggering discussions when we're at the workplace. I loved how he said, yeah, but we shouldn't be the chaplains to our families, though. That was good.
Definitely. It's not helpful to them and it's not helpful to us, I don't think, when we try to step into those roles. But I also appreciate what he said about taking it seriously, because that's another thing is when we are scared of having these conversations and we dismiss them, we are dismissing more than just what's on the surface. We're dismissing something that is really important to that person and it's part of their identity and in their values. And I loved how he said what they fear, because there's so much that we can uncover in what people fear. And sometimes that may be more pressing to their mind than their own physical illness, talking about healthcare, whatever context people are, serve as a chaplain, whatever they come to you to talk about, or they may be in the hospital for a particular problem, but maybe it's something else that they fear that they're mostly worried about, and that can be expressed through politics. So
there was that study where some doctors' offices stopped putting the news on when they had people in the office, and because they wanted to see, well, is this contributing to an unhealthy fear? And potentially exploring with the person, well, how much do you spend watching X, Y, and Z? How much time do you spend?
Well, I have a blessing today to share. It's from a book by Kate Bowler and Jessica Ritchie. It's The Lives We Actually Have. I love these blessings because they're so down to earth. And this blessing is for loving someone when differences divide us. It says, God, this is a hard one. How do I begin to love or even connect with someone so different from me? How do I bridge this gap? It feels just as wrong as the beliefs I abhor. Blessed are we who want to be a part of the wild and beautiful experiment to find a common humanity, who desire to come willingly into the gap that separates human from human, to love the stranger, especially the one we really don't understand and secretly want to set straight. Blessed are we willing to stay in the gap, in the contradictions of what we can't understand, to actively work on disproving our own intuitions about another in order to begin to see what they see. Blessed are we swimming upstream against the current of our own human frailty, our fears and emotions, and willing to be wrong for a second, to reconsider and hold to our integrity with kindness, desiring to see the lay of the land and play the course, instead of the one we wished it could be, and to discover that humility is what makes change possible. Grace is never neutral. It works backwards and forwards in time, conspiring to make the wrong right. The Lives We Have by Kate Buller. Thank you all for listening today. It's been such a good conversation. Stay well. Bye.
So if you'd like to hear more, please like, share, subscribe on your favorite podcast locations. And by the way, thank you so much for those who've left reviews. Please keep that up. And if you want to call and leave us a voicemail and share your ideas for future episodes, please call our voicemail at 502-536-7508. Again, that's 502-536-7508.
Oh, there's the music major. Opera came out. Bye.
Blessings.